this stuff around kind of these dark techno utopians controlling the world, like in a funny way, like it's giving the world too little credit and it's giving the techno utopians too much credit.
Claude Shannon, the father of information theory, all the way to Peter Thiel and Elon Musk, the founders of PayPal, we've had an explosion, a 50-year explosion of innovation in information technology. And it has led us to what promises to be an era of prosperity and increased connection around the globe. But there's also a dark side. Today, we're going to explore the idea that information technology and connectivity through the internet can lead to a utopian, prosperous world, or as many conservatives believe, a libertine hell. My guest today is Jimmy Soni. He's a historian in the tech world, really. His first book that I was aware of is called A Mind at Play. It's about Claude Shannon and his theories about information technology. And then his latest book, which is a tome, is The Founders, and it's about Elon Musk, Peter Thiel, and the group that was assembled to found PayPal and really kick off internet transactions and the world that exploded during the pandemic. Welcome, Jimmy. Thank you for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, this book is as I said, it's a tome. And I recommend people do get it because there's a lot of interesting stories in here, and we're going to jump into them in a second. But I was going to be obnoxious and hold it up next to Empire of Debt, which is a book that I wrote. And yours is 467 pages, which includes the index. Mine's 468 pages, which
right.
includes the index.
That's great. So, well, hey, here's to writing long books in an era of tweets, I don't know if you have this feeling, but sometimes I do feel like I'm like the guy who's making like the Model T as cars are being electrified, right? Or like I'm still out there selling horse and buggies, right? Like exactly. When people are promoting self-driving cars, I'm like, no, it's great. This is a fantastic mode of transportation.
Well, if you ever get the bug to turn it into a documentary, I only have one piece of advice: make sure you get Final Cut rights, because after I wrote Empire of Debt with Bill Bonner, I was like, oh, it'll be so much easier to give somebody a DVD and have them watch it than, this 468 page book. In an age where people are usually consuming sound bites and video clips online. But congratulations anyway. It's an achievement to write research and write that kind of book, but to have it published and distributed is great. Congratulations.
It's actually funny that your title was Empire of Debt. One of the provisional titles for the book at one point was Empire of Risk.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So it went through a few iterations on. I mean, I'm sure you can appreciate this. Like you can kind of find your way to a title eventually. When I sold it, it was untitled. When it was at the sort of second title was Empire of Risk, because risk and risk management is a big part of the business itself, meaning you get any Tom, Dick, or Harry could create a payment system, but what you're really doing if you create a payment system is inviting a lot of risk. So then I had this whole sort of like Empire of Risk theme in my head, and then it evolved from there to this will never work. But then I think some like co-founders of Netflix or something, like one of the early people at Netflix wrote a book called That Will Never Work. And so I was like, dashed. All right, those dreams are dashed.
Yeah.
And then I later sort of settled on The Founders, which I've come to really actually like as a title, but it took a little bit. And I almost had a cousin title to yours.
Yeah, well, it's interesting that you even say that, because after I made the documentary that goes along with Empire of Debt, I started I had a film crew, and we had a producer and all that kind of stuff. It was like the enterprise was way bigger than I wanted to be. So after we released that, I started another documentary project on my own called, I didn't have a director or a producer or anything. I just started doing the filming. And that one was called Risk.
That's
so it's kind of ironic that we were.
And it was 8 hours of people just playing the board game, you doing live. It was Twitch before there was Twitch, but for Risk.
Right. Well, let's get started. I want to, one of the excerpts from the book was recently published in Fortune magazine, and it's about an early internship that Elon Musk had just after he got out of grad school. I wanted to get started with Elon Musk because, as we were talking about before we even got started here, it seems like every time he has a thought in his head, it turns into a headline somewhere. And most recently, in the week before we're talking here, he took a major stake in, or a 9% stake in Twitter, and then they invited him to join the board, which he declined. So as we're talking about this, there's still some speculation on what his role in Twitter is going to be. But I thought that might be a good jumping off point for us, because I'm interested in what you learned about his character. The excerpt of the book that's published in Fortune is very revealing about the way he views the world. And when he was on Saturday Night Live not too long ago, he said he was the first host that was on the spectrum. And I can see how that would play an extreme role in his character and how he approaches the world. What can you tell me about, well, why don't we just start with his first internship? There's some interesting details in there.
Yeah. And I think it's important for people who are listening or watching to appreciate that. Actually, I'll tell by way of story. I had this pretty rigorous policy that I established for the last 5.5 years while I was doing this book. And the policy was communicated to my friends. It was enforced on my laptop using technological tools, and then with my friends just using kind of like text to them. And it was basically, please don't share news or information with me about Reid Hoffman, Peter Thiel, Elon Musk, or any of the people I'm writing about, because for two reasons. One is I was like, it'll stress me out. Like the richer they get, the more stressed I get, right? And the other is I don't want to pollute my understanding of the people they were before they were the 2021 and 2022 versions, right? So if you are mainlining the SNL thing or this thing or that controversy or this, you are sort of always then like taking this lens that you've built or tried to build, where you're looking at, a young Elon Musk from basically the moment he arrives in North America, which is when my story and writing about him really start, through to about 2002, 2003. So I had a really narrow window, which is just a long way of saying, like, I don't really know about the, meaning I can't speculate. It would be pure speculation if I had any thoughts about his decisions around Twitter or really any of his decisions past like 2003. That said, when he arrives in North America, he's here. He emigrates from South Africa, and that Fortune excerpt you point to is the story of how he secured his first internship. And I had this extraordinary experience of, there's a lot of people I think who talk to him, and he obviously says a lot in the world. I had a wonderful vantage point, which is I found Dr. Peter Nicholson, who was, Elon's first and one of his only bosses ever and mentors ever. And I ended up having a really delightful series of exchanges with him, conversations with him about basically like, what was it like to be his boss when he was 19 and he was doing his first internship at this bank. The remarkable thing, and I don't think a lot of people know this, is that they're still in touch to this day, and that it's a mutual admiration society. Elon still thinks of Dr. Nicholson as like one of these gigantic brains. He literally, that was what he said to me, is like, he's super smart, a gigantic brain. And on going the other way, Dr. Nicholson, who was he had done an undergraduate degree in physics, done a lot of different things. He was in the world of politics. He was in finance. He was at one point like an advisor to the Prime Minister of Canada and stuff. And he says, he's like, I'm just endlessly proud of my mentee. He doesn't wear it on a t-shirt. He's actually very, very understated. He doesn't try to trade on this at all. Frankly, I think I may be one of the last people he talks to, because it's gotten all to be a little too overwhelming. But he really admires and said to me, that in some ways the Elon that he sees in the world today is the same one that cold called him, basically asking for an internship, right? Without any preamble or like really like an introduction. Like they had lunch, the Musk brothers had lunch with Dr. Nicholson because Elon cold called Peter Nicholson. They get together for lunch. And essentially he hustles his way into this internship, and a friendship and a mentorship relationship forms. And so it was interesting for me to hear that. And I sort of pressed, I said, Dr. Nicholson, what do you mean by that? The sort of, he's very much the same. And one of the things he said is, even then our casual conversations were about space travel. And they were about what it would take for mankind to become multiplanetary, to begin to explore different planets, to build reusable rocket capacity to do that. So it is, if you think about these things, I think there's this whole criticism now that like, oh, this is just like the billionaires want to take over the next series of planets, or like it's just wealthy people trafficking in rockets. At the time that Dr. Nicholson and a young Elon Musk are talking about rockets and space travel, Elon is 19 and doesn't have any money to his name, And so these are long held fascinations, ambitions, passions. And so to my mind, that's actually one of the most interesting things about his character. And one of the things that I think, I have a 6-year-old daughter, and often though you become a parent, you think about a lot of this stuff. I'm like, my daughter's really passionate about gymnastics. I hope she's as passionate in a half decade or a decade as she is now, right? Because we tend to fall in and out of love with the things that we really like. Mm-hmm. And it seems to me that one of the things that's true that people often overlook is that these interests of his, the internet, electrical energy, space exploration, didn't begin overnight. They didn't begin because he lucked into money and then decided to turn it into more money. I mean, that's a really, I would say, backwards understanding of the level of conviction around some of these things. So that's like one of many observations. But the story you talk about is this very interesting bond with a mentor that still exists to this day.
Yeah, and he the way I understand it, he had studied physics. That was his primary interest when he went into school, college, and then graduate school. But then he realized that he would just end up working in some lab for somebody else. So he also studied business, and that's what led him into the banking world. There is one anecdote where he had come up with an idea for the bank to make a lot of money, and then they just kind of blew him off or something. He just got disgruntled with the whole world of finance, and then ended up just being like, all right, I'm going to do it on my own anyway.
I think, and again, it's you sort of have to put these things in context and make sure you're not making too much of anecdotes. But this, and I really kicked the tires on this story a lot, just to make sure that I had it right. But essentially, the Bank of Nova Scotia, what is known as Scotiabank, is where Elon does one of his first internships. And that's where this mentor, Dr. Nicholson, works. At one point, Elon recognizes that there's some opportunity with bad foreign debt that the bank has, where it's going to be converted into Brady bonds. And essentially, you're going to have like all of this debt that is valueless, that's suddenly, because no one wants the financial collapse that would happen if this debt, imploded. You've got the US government, the IMF, the UN, a bunch of other bodies kind of participating in a series of fixes to figure out, like, how are we going to make sure that these governments don't collapse, that these economies don't just like go into wholesale shock. Because of the Brady bond proposal, what Elon recognizes is this quote unquote toxic debt is going to have more value in the future than it does now, right? By virtue of the fact that it's backed by the government. And so he tries to encourage his superiors at the bank to like aggressively buy more of this debt, right? And it's an interesting moment because you have this sort of young person, very young, with no real experience, sort of writing and like kind of beating on about how they need to do this. It's like a risk worth taking. It'll be worth billions of dollars. You could make billions overnight. And his mentor, Dr. Nicholson, sort of the proposal isn't going to fly. The bank isn't going to do it. But he did say, like, in the sort of like long arc of history, he was right. The toxic debt ended up not being toxic because it was backed by these entities. The creditors had to take a little bit of a haircut. There was a longer repayment schedule, but you could price the debt, and so it created a market for it. Now, I think you can go argue for and against whether it would have been a sound proposal. What is really interesting is that the CEO of Scotiabank, Cedric Ritchie, he actually held on to this debt while other Canadian banks sold. And so the way Dr. Nicholson explained it to me, he said, look, Elon and Cedric both had the same idea. It was just that Elon's risk tolerance was a lot higher because obviously he wasn't subject to the board. He was an intern at a bank. Like, he's not going to be held accountable for that sort of decision. For Elon, the lesson was that banks are unwilling to take big risks and they're unwilling to innovate. And that's an idea that lodges in his mind, and it stays with him through his first startup and then into the startup that becomes PayPal. And his ambition is to, meaningfully and consequentially change finance from the ground up by taking the kind of risks that traditional banks wouldn't.
So he carries that sort of approach into the second startup, which is PayPal, and somewhere along the line he meets Peter Thiel, who is also an interesting sort of iconoclast in the financial world. He was just speaking at Bitcoin 2022 down in Miami, and called Warren Buffett and Jamie Dimon part of the gerontology set of the financial markets, which I just thought was entertaining, and it actually got headlines, because I don't know if he was just making a joke or not, but it's just interesting that they both have this kind of brash sort of approach to risk taking, but also like how they envision the future coming about. At what point do they meet before PayPal starts becoming gelling into a real thing?
Yeah, so it's one of the more interesting, when you go back and trace the history, they're known as the co-founders today, obviously, along with Max Levchin and a few others, Luke Nosik, Yupan, Russ Simmons. Interestingly, Elon's company, X.com, has a totally different ambition than Peter Thiel and Max Levchin's company. So Peter and Max build this company it was first called BuildLink, then it was called Confinity. They build a product called PayPal. And the idea at the outset is we're going to beam money between Palm Pilots, and then it evolves to become, we're going to transfer money between people over email. So if Addison, if I have to pay you $10, I can do it just by plugging in your email address and sending you that over email. For Elon, the ambition is we're going to do X.com is going to do everything financial under the sun, but he also has success with an email-based money product. And it's weird, like he describes it even later. He says, we had all these like complicated things we had built, and we'd done all this time and energy to get the regulations right, like try to do all this stuff. And we had savings and brokerage accounts. But the thing that people were most excited about was this emailing money product. These two companies come into existence at around the same time. Their product starts to succeed at around the same time. And it's around that time that they realize they are competitors, and they compete very fiercely over a period of, let's say, a month and a half to try to win the email money payments race. Peter is among those who early on recognizes, like, look, Elon's going to spend us out of oblivion, or we're both going to tank. We need to find a way to fuse these entities together. And that begins the process of uniting X.com with Confinity, which yields the company that we know today as PayPal. But they were really two companies that came together as one. And it wasn't, this was, I described in the book as sort of a shotgun wedding. It was a little bit of that. There were some really, these are high-powered, high-charged personalities, a lot of EQ points in the room, a lot of IQ points in the room. And so there was but that's the backstory. And I think, it unites two teams of technologists. And it's really interesting to run the counterfactual of like, what if that hadn't happened, all of that. But more important is that it does sort of bring all these people into one company as opposed to being in two companies.
Yeah. What would you say then is, you say there's a lot of IQ swirling around the room. What would you say is the unifying characteristic of Musk and Thiel and a number of the other characters that you talk about in the book, but that go on to do greater things in PayPal? PayPal like spurned a whole industry of people innovating their way into billions. What is it? What's the characteristic? Like, I go down to the local tavern and I sit next to some guy that's selling insurance, and he makes a good life for himself, and he takes care of his kids. He enjoys himself, but he has the same number of hours every day that Elon Musk does, and the same that Peter Thiel does, and any number of entrepreneurs that have been inspired by those guys. What is the quality? I'm asking that question even for my own productivity. I feel like I'm a reasonably productive person, but I'm not planning to put anyone on Mars anytime soon.
Well, I think, look, it's a question that I think I'll continue to ask myself for, the next 20 or 30 years, even after doing this book. There's a way in which, like, so I wrote about a company, a group of people, right? And they've become, world renowned now for the different entrepreneurial ventures that have largely happened after PayPal. So the founders of YouTube, came out of this company. The founders of Yelp, Palantir, LinkedIn, SpaceX, Tesla, several billionaires, right? A bunch of millionaires. And they're also, it's not just commerce. They've become advisors to governors, presidents. They have written best-selling books. They've done things in Hollywood. I mean, they're sort of all over, right? And I only say that to establish that I think there's a couple common threads, but I don't know that there's sort of like one, like there was no secret handshake, right? There's not like one little thing that they're all doing, but I did identify a few commonalities. I think one, and it's an easy one to overlook, is especially early in their lives, there's a rigorous commitment to self-education. And there's a real like autodidact streak in this group. And I noticed it in little ways. Like I would notice, for example, like quotes that they would give me or things they would play back to me that were not stories that like are on the tip of my tongue, right? So when I asked Elon about being ousted at PayPal, and I asked him why he didn't torch the company in the aftermath, like why didn't he go to the press and just like flame everybody after he'd been like ousted in this coup? And he referenced King Solomon in the Bible, right? And sort of gave me this like sort of his version of the judgment of Solomon. These two women come before King Solomon. They have a baby. There's some dispute over the baby's mom, and the king, as a test, is, oh, let's split the baby in half. And then one of the women speaks up and says, don't do that. I'd rather have this person. And then King Solomon says, well, that's the mom, because that person is deciding to give up the child rather than and spare the child's life. He referenced that story. I remember interviewing somebody about Max Levchin, and this gentleman said to me, one of the most interesting experiences I had is I went to lunch with Max, and I think then girlfriend was there. And he said, Max came in with a book, and the book was, it might've been a Richard Feynman book, but it was a book about a physicist or about physics. And he said, hey, Max, like, what are you reading there? And Max looked at him and to a stone face, very soberly says, oh, this is my physicist of the moment. And when Max like walked away from the table, the then girlfriend, I think, leaned in and said, who has a physicist of the moment? Like, and by the way, Max is not he's not a physicist. So it is actually peculiar. Yeah. I had read this anecdote about Peter Thiel's passion for James Joyce. Reid Hoffman, explained to me that sort of we walked through intellectual history, including Claude Shannon and others, and von Neumann. I was impressed, given their day jobs, the sheer range of cultural, literary, and other references. And then when I learned more about their early lives, what I realized is that a lot of them spent their childhoods like buried in books. And it's just, it's a small thing, but I actually think it's a big thing if you think about it, meaning that like we have this tendency to view engineering and technological development as a narrow skill set, like ones and zeros written in sequence in some way, producing the products that, you and I use to have this Zoom meeting. I would venture to argue that there is a much wider range of reading and of just general intellectual interest than meets the eye. And by the way, let me give you the prime example. Max Levchin has seen Kurosawa's Seven Samurai by his own admission in public 111.5 times. And the 0.5 is on Twitter recently because he is halfway through it with his children. But he's seen it over 100, and he calls it his sole source of management training. But to watch film noir from, black and white 3-hour Japanese movie 111 times, like you've got to have a particular kind of interest in things that are not just like, here's my engineering, canon. I think that's one common feature. The second common feature I would say is there's a degree of competitiveness to this group that is self-evident even when you meet them today, right? They're like, and for me, I'm not in competition with them, so I sort of describe it as like wonderfully competitive, right? Because I'm not on the other side of this, right? But I would imagine that if you were going to tango with any of these people in business, you are in for it. I mean, you're competing against people who are willing to work 24 hours a day, 7 days a week to win. And I, there's upsides to that. There's certainly downsides to that. But I saw it even in my discussions with one of the co-founders. During the middle of my interview with him, I had said something about the market cap of PayPal versus the market cap of Visa. And mid-interview, he pulled out his phone and Googled the market caps to make sure that PayPal was still winning, right? Despite no connection with the company to this day. That's a level of competitiveness that I don't think of as like what you would find from the insurance guy at the bar necessarily, right? Like unless he happens to be like an unusually competitive insurance salesman. The third thing that I found interesting, and I'll stop after this. I mean, obviously there's a bunch of features, but I did find that there's an embrace of disagreement so long as the disagreement is backed by intelligence. And so there are people in this story who disagree like cats and dogs about many, many things, but there is a fundamental respect for the person's intelligence, meaning like you could yell and scream at each other, but it was never really personal. And I think the reason it never morphed into the personal is because someone like a David Sachs, who's in contest with someone like a Roloff Botha, there is a healthy respect for the other person's intelligence, right? It doesn't always mean things are going to be pleasant, but it does mean that there's a respect. I found that to be true in the company's operations, but then more broadly, I found it to be true just like in my interactions with them, where the differences of opinion were always almost always about the ideas, not the personalities. And I think that's hard to get right. I mean, I have a hard time. Everyone has a hard time with it. You sort of want arguments to morph into the ad hominem because it's like, you know, it's emotionally pleasing. I found that there was a tendency to like argue very vocally, but have respect for intelligence.
So those traits you feel like just call them the three traits, were existing prior to PayPal, prior to
100% yes.
Yeah.
I mean, that much I know to be true just in having researched the early lives of some of these people. I think that the competitiveness, the wide ranging kind of just a curiosity, we'll call it like a roving curiosity, and this sort of real respect for intelligence. And it, by the way, came out when I would ask them about PayPal. I had this moment where I interviewed Max and I asked him about Elon, and they were competitors, right? So there was this very vicious battle. And I asked both of them about the other person. And Max, I'll never forget, he gets in, and it's in the book. He says, you know, we're talking to this Elon guy, and he goes, and he just looks down. And he's like, he's obviously completely crazy, but he's really smart, and I really like smart people. So there was an immediate affinity where he was like, he could identify that this person might be really driving me crazy, but he's really smart, and he's making life hard for my company, Confinity. On the other end of it, one of the things that Elon had emphasized with me is he said, please don't make it seem like I didn't have respect for the Confinity people. I really did. Like, it was hard for me to meet people who could keep up with my pace of technology and development and business building, and these guys could. And so there was this, like, you know, it's like this kind of game respects game almost, right? That's what I found. And I think that was true prior to the lives of PayPal, and it was certainly true at PayPal.
So as you were just looking at the characters, and they developed into the sort of their superstars in the Silicon Valley world, but also they have become almost like pop celebrities as well. Obviously, Musk is on Saturday Night Live. That's not easily achievable if you're not a comic, and it was just a rarity, right? But you mostly looked at their early lives and then what they would become. And then you mentioned that you tried not to figure out what they were up to these days while you were researching and writing the book. But of the characters that you are talking about, who, like, maybe name three of your the accomplishments they achieved after PayPal, and what was most remarkable of that experience of being in PayPal. What did it lead to beyond that? Obviously, we have SpaceX and some other things with Elon Musk, and Peter Thiel has Palantir. But just maybe name some of the other people that were just birthed out of this cauldron of creativity.
Well, I mean, I think, look, if you've ever watched a YouTube video, you have three early PayPal employees to thank, right? Chad Hurley, yeah, there's this trio that helped to build YouTube, and they cut their teeth at PayPal. And in fact, it's really interesting because you asked sort of what effect did it have? Well, one of the things that makes YouTube very successful is what might be called the strategy of making it easy to embed YouTube videos throughout the internet. Well, that embedding strategy was part and parcel of what made PayPal successful, because being able to embed a PayPal button throughout the internet is part of what the company used to grow beyond this very narrow market on eBay. And so building a flexible and indeed like aggressive embedding strategy you could tie a direct line, and these folks I interviewed did, between PayPal and YouTube, right? My favorite story there is that one of the YouTube co-founders said, we learned that at PayPal, like, there would often be platforms that were annoyed if a PayPal button appeared. And the way to deal with the annoyance was to get the customers to complain to the platform and have the button reinstated. Well, when MySpace got upset that YouTube videos were suddenly festooning its pages, they did the exact same thing. They had MySpace users call like MySpace corporate, put the number up publicly, and enough complaints were lodged that the policy had to retreat, right? So that YouTube videos, and they learned this directly from their experience interacting with PayPal. And the lesson there was, if you are adding value to users that is in excess of the annoyance to the platform, you can always get users to advocate for you. And PayPal's users actually ended up being powerful advocates for them throughout the fights that they had with eBay. And eBay was the first place that PayPal really took off. So that's but one example. There are plenty of others. I think that one of the more interesting ones to me is that there was a small group of these individuals who went into Hollywood after PayPal. So David Sachs produces a film called Thank You for Smoking. And it's like nominated for 2 Golden Globes. And there are a handful of PayPal alumni who are still involved in the film industry. And to me, that is actually like they don't just go into it, they have success there, right? And they learned this playbook of kind of being able to go into an industry that you have no knowledge of, getting very, very smart about it, and then kind of eking out a win, right? So if you look at everything from like SpaceX and space logistics, Palantir and big data, Kiva.org and microfinance, YouTube, which is like internet video, and the film industry, right? You sort of have this skill set of, we're not going to be intimidated by being neophytes to an industry. We're actually going to that's going to help. That's an advantage. Being like inexperienced can actually be a virtue, because you haven't learned bad habits, is like one of the big takeaways that I had in the course of doing this project.
I kind of want to move into one of the things that I'm interested in talking about. I've been looking at the impact of information technology and networks, and we just concluded a series on what are called network swarms. The idea that we're in an interconnected world, and when an event happens, people can come together and share an opinion. And the example that we were exploring was the response to Russian invasion of Ukraine, where the world kind of threw this hissy fit and was like morally outraged at the Russians, and then within a 10-day period canceled Russian culture, kicked them off the banks and everything. There is a component of the connectedness that has a dark side to it too. And as you're looking at the innovative culture that spawned PayPal and the environment in which all this innovation took place, to what extent do you, as they go on and do other things, do they carry that sort of libertarian economic view that innovation is what drives prosperity? And to what extent are they aware of the sort of darker side of a connected world? And that's not to say that it's more of an observation that how frightening it could be. Like, if we're morally outraged that the Russians invaded Ukraine, that's one thing, but what if the swarm decides some other thing that damages people, but it has the support of a immense network of people? I guess I'm looking for some kind of your thoughts on the impact of all of this, starting from Cloud Shannon all the way through to the preponderance of economic activity happening in this network environment.
Yeah, it's interesting. Like I tend to because of the work I do, I focus on the micro details in history that might add up to like the story of for in Claude Shannon's case, sort of how his life came to be and how it tied together with his work in information theory. And then in the case of PayPal, it's like all of these little decisions and actions from college and beyond that led to the creation of PayPal. And I think, this is going to maybe be an unsatisfying answer, but the answer I come up with is, at least in the PayPal case, like there were some theories about, call it sort of like small L libertarianism, that were a useful recruitment tool, right? But ultimately, like PayPal is working side by side with the Secret Service and the FBI to help solve financial crimes when it's like, becomes a private company and is about to go public. There might have been some notions about world revolution in finance, that were sort of echoes of the modern cryptocurrency movement. But ultimately, like PayPal is filling out regulatory paperwork in Europe to make sure that its services can. So, I think that there's a tendency to like believe that the ideas are the thing itself, or that like they carry the power. And I think they're very, very good for recruiting and for sloganeering. But in general, like the company's story is a story of dealing with like of having to deal with urgent problems that come up in the creation of a startup, right? And like how do you start from nothing and build something, bring it to scale, build a business around that scale, and then take that company public? It's really hard to do that, I think, if you're sort of like making broad arguments about like kind of economic philosophy. It's much easier to do it if you are quietly and carefully courting eBay and Visa and MasterCard and all these other entities to actually make your business work. I also would add that I think if you were to interview any one of the 200 plus people that I spoke to, they'd have a different answer to the question that you just asked, meaning innovation as it relates to technology, the proliferation of digital networks, the value of digital communication. I think net, like if you had to flip a coin, it's highly likely that the people that that I spoke to are going to say technology is generally a force for good in the world, right? That it has led to some economic prosperity, that it's improved prospects in different fields. But I'm not sure that there's sort of a slogan that they would all kind of get behind or agree to. And I would say even within this group, if you were to ask that question to a Reid Hoffman and a Peter Thiel, you're likely to get different answers, right? Meaning that there's maybe more concern or there's maybe more for or against government regulation on one end or the other end of the spectrum, that one might be more attendant to certain issues than the other. From my perspective, I'm sort of glass half full on technology, right? Like I mean, maybe that's just dewy-eyed optimism, and maybe I'm a touch Pollyanna, but my view is, it is just as I think about sort of at my personal level, it's extraordinary to me to see Claude Shannon's ideas come to fruition in the last 2 years amid a pandemic, when because of compression algorithms that he was working on, you and I are able to have this conversation over Zoom without any loss or without any real kind of difficulty. That is, to me, really, really powerful and interesting. And I think of that as something to preserve, to defend, and to champion. Like that is theory meeting hard reality in a way that outlasted Shannon, right? I like those kinds of contributions, the contributions that have an effect like 5 decades after, right? Where the butterfly effect like only comes into effect, on an April afternoon in 2022, and Claude Shannon is working on that stuff in 1948. I just find that stuff really cool.
Yeah. Well, I would probably share, if you pressed me and I wasn't thinking about it already, I would share your sort of Pollyanna view. And certainly we've had sort of a compressed speed at which the adaptation or the acceptance of technology has happened when everybody's locked in their houses and we all went on Zoom and everything during the pandemic. But I hear this phrase, which kind of bothers me. And then I'm wondering what the root of it is, that Silicon Valley, they had this libertarian approach to their way their business and the culture was all about innovation and everything. And now that they're rich and famous and they're billionaires, they've turned around and they're trying to control the planet. And there's something so thin about that idea. that it just bothers me, because
Yeah,
as you're pointing out, there's like nuance even within the group that you interviewed for the book on PayPal itself. Is probably a selection or a cross section that's similar to the population itself. I would imagine.
yeah,
But
that's exactly right. Like if you were to look at if someone did the math on the political contributions for Reid Hoffman and Peter Thiel, it would be very funny to see how much of them cancel each other out. Meaning like on either side, the people they're giving to, like, did it just like net on the ledger just end up like being like, oh, it's a wash, right? I also think this stuff around kind of these dark techno utopians controlling the world, like in a funny way, like it's giving the world too little credit and it's giving the techno utopians too much credit. Like let's be clear that for the vast majority of the writing that is done about their politics occupies, in my estimation, a very small amount of the time and mind share that they actually, and money that they actually have. Right. So if you were to look at to look at the Google Calendar, let's say, let's look at Reid Hoffman's Google Calendar or Elon Musk's Google Calendar.
yeah,
The proportion of time that is spent thinking about the government is probably pretty small. There's no big blocks of time that are like devoted to that. The problems are far more common to what you would find in the case of Reid, of like a venture capitalist, like listening to pitches, right, from young people who want to start businesses. And in the case of somebody who's running an automotive company and a space logistics company, it's hiring senior executives and dealing with product launches and all of these sort of mundane things. The problem is the mundane things don't make for good headlines or press.
right.
And so you have to focus, for example, on a big political contribution that sounds like a big sum of money in a Senate race in Arizona. Except that what you miss is that amount of money is not a very large sum for that person, right? Or these other things. Now, I don't want to minimize the depth of their commitment to their particular political philosophies or beliefs, but I think there's this tendency to think that they have more agency in these matters than like they actually do, right? I would also say that particularly with someone like Max Levchin, like it's actually hard to pin him down on a grand theory of anything. Here's where it's really easy to get him lit up is he likes building businesses. Like his sort of basic answer to things is like, but I just like building businesses. Like I'm just a guy who is predisposed to do this. It's like if I would be doing it as a hobby, right? He has built Slide and PayPal, a firm. He incubated a company called Glow that's dealing with women's fertility issues, right? And when asked, when truly pressed for big theories, he's like, I'm a guy who likes using technology to build businesses. Like that's about it, right? I only say that because I strive in my writing, particularly with the PayPal book, to remember the humanity at the heart of these sort of like Mount Rushmore style figures, right? Like I don't want them to be seen like they are bigger than they are, because it's actually like important at the level of like young people wanting to aspire to be them, meaning like they're not some exalted status. The other thing is you miss the part of it that is earnest, that's funny, that's random, that's nerdy. You miss the video games, you miss the coding, you miss the early difficulties when you only look at like the big CNBC headline that says, some crazy thing that happened that day. It doesn't mean we should be ignorant of it, but let's not like give this class of people too much credit for controlling the world when like really actually they don't have that power. It just seems to me it gets a little hyperbolic. Like it also they don't think of themselves that way. I don't think of them that way, and most people I think don't.
Yeah. Well, would it be fair to say this then, that they're building technology that works and people can use it for whatever motives they might have? And I'm thinking particularly of cancel culture that gets associated with technology because it thrives on social media, and these big companies also wield the power to deplatform people. They can kick people off if they want to. So is it fair to say that they don't really consider it that way? They're just trying to run a safe business. One of the defenses of deplatforming people is that they're private networks and you sign a terms of use. And if you violate the terms of use, which might be like the type of language you use or the opinions you hold, that they are within their rights as owners of private networks to let you go. But just reading into what you're saying or listening to, or what I hear, is that they're more interested in just building their businesses, and they're not as keyed into the political motives that might get somebody canceled for whatever reason. And there's a lot of people that you could throw in that basket, like Trump got kicked off Twitter, Putin, his whole network got kicked off the banking system, all the oligarchs.
I think, at the very basic level, like, I think it would really depend on who in this group you were interviewing.
Yeah,
None of them are really outside. So far as I know, they all have comments about things that are happening on Twitter, but Elon is a shareholder. I don't know the degree to the involvement of the rest of them. I know Reid Hoffman obviously built LinkedIn, which is a different kind of social network. So he might have well-formed thoughts on this. I think Peters has well-formed thoughts on this just based on his participation in politics. But, like, if I were to take like one of the figures that I really, came to admire, is this engineer, Russ Simmons, who was one of the early PayPal people, a co-founder of Yelp. I like Russ isn't sitting around like he wouldn't necessarily have a view. Like, in his view, I think most likely would be like, I hope I built great products with the code that I know how to write. Like, I hope that Yelp added value for people who are restaurateurs and other local small business owners. And, like, one hopes that these things are used in certain ways. And I think when you have success and you respond to customers effectively, like, you can see that play out live. But I don't think it's in some ways like you build something. How I know that it's a bit of an accident? Because PayPal's success was a bit of an accident. They find success on a platform that none of them actually use day to day, which is eBay. They become the de facto payment solution for eBay because eBay hasn't fixed its payment problems. It's the way I know that there's not some divine 30-year, 40-year plan that they've got to control the information airwaves or anything of that sort, because the first big success was like largely accidental.
yeah.
They built a great product and they refined it over time, and thank goodness they did, because of all these other things. And I think for eBay buyers and sellers, it was a huge upgrade in their ability to pay. But nobody on that team set out to design the ideal eBay payment system.
Right.
So I just think we need to, that's the reason I have a healthy skepticism about the folks who are like, well, this is the motive behind, the acquisition or his 9% shares. I'm like, we don't know. I haven't asked him. Maybe he just really likes the product and thought it was a good company, and he bought that stock the same way, I might buy 100 shares of something. He's able to buy 9.2% of something, right? Like, Occam's razor tends to actually be true in a lot of situations. I have all these friends who have these like very, very elaborate conspiracy theories around like why one thing connects to the next, connects to the next, connects to the next. And I think to myself, like, oh my God, like, if that were true, why wasn't PayPal easier? Right? Like, why was it essentially a 4-year story of like near miss, almost failure, catastrophic problem? If they were this smart, one would think like you could have figured all that out. It's the reason that I suspect that the motives are a lot more down to earth than people tend to think.
Yeah, usually when I have this conversation with anyone, I reference my own experience in business. We built Agora and Agora Financial to a sizable publishing company, but almost none of it was by plan.
There you go.
We would try things and we're like, oh, cool, let's do that again. And then we would move in that direction. And we tried a number of things that just didn't work. That never saw the light of day. But that's always been my philosophy in business, is that you got to keep trying until you find the thing that seems like you could devote more time and resources to. And it sounds like that's the innovative culture that thrived in Silicon Valley forever. And it's also that seems to be what's driving crypto technology, with innovation using blockchain in the financial tech world, and also just with the cryptocurrencies themselves. And that's sort of a global phenomenon now, not just Silicon Valley as a geographical spot, but more like now we're all interconnected and people are using the next iteration of technology to develop all new kinds of things. I think also when innovation makes its way into the mainstream consciousness, as crypto is doing now, there are a lot of people that just think, oh man, that's scary, I don't want to think about it. And so you get a lot of criticism from people who are either late adopters or just are afraid of that level of change to the way that they perceive the world to
Well,
exist.
and I would actually argue crypto is a really good example of a situation where it feels like the motives, it feels like what's attached to the motives is a shadowy narrative that necessarily isn't true. So I'll give you the example from my own research, which is when I spoke to Elon about money and about kind of what money's role is in the world, right? We had this conversation where he started talking about what money is. And his line, it's in the book, is money is an information system, right? And what he drew on there was actually Claude Shannon. And he referenced Shannon. He said, Shannon had this information theory. And he goes, and what do you think? He's like, think about the terms that Shannon was using to describe information, terms like latency, right? And friction, like the friction within our existing money system. We've all experienced it. You've received a wire transfer and you get like a $25 fee for the wire transfer. And you ask yourself at some point, maybe you don't try to reverse the fee, but you ask yourself like, wait, why am I paying for this? Right? Like what did exactly the bank do other than move a few ones and zeros from point A to point B? His view at the time and now was the internet and digital technology has made it possible to move ones and zeros with very, very, very low cost. So why are bank customers paying so much in fees, right? That was actually one of the big things behind X.com was a big war on fees. And you could tie that to some of the ambitions of the modern cryptocurrency movement, which is sort of saying to people, wait, it should be really easy for me to make a down payment on a house that doesn't require, this amount of delay, a 3-day delay between when I decide to press send and when the money is received somewhere. I think that there's ways in which even the language of this, it's not about necessarily overthrowing the Federal Reserve so much as it is pointing out some of the deficits and some of the systems that we have already, which is what he has been doing for a long, long time. And I take him at his word because I heard him and saw in public and looked against records of transcripts from conversations from 20 years ago, where he's describing money as an information system, as a means by which you and I communicate, not as, this thing that we can't change. When he speaks about digitizing money, he's talking about databases that banks run, and he's still on about the databases and the mainframes. So I think there's a different kind of cast to some of this, where it's not big P political, it's almost like small t technological. Like if the code that JP Morgan Chase is using on its servers is written in a language that existed in the 1980s, that's a problem, and it's a problem for consumers because we have better options now. And so I think in some ways it's sort of more mundane, but there's a lot of power in that kind of thinking. But it's a different language than some of the stuff you'll see if it's commentary about them. And that like, again, this is just, I'm playing back what they said to me, which is really around technology's ability to improve different and speed up different sectors of American life in a way that reduces friction for consumers. And I'm not sure that, there's not a space in our society, there's not a sector in our society at this point where that is not true. It has negative externalities, to be sure, but I think one can recognize that, mitigate those, have hard conversations about the pros and cons, and not do anything illegal, but still see technology as a way to lever up elements of society. One of the funny things in the PayPal story is that somebody had said to me, Peter Thiel had this no orange jumpsuits rule. So you can run right up to the line of the law and we can do whatever we want in terms of innovating, but don't ever cross the no orange jump. Don't enter into the bright line where we're going to end up defrauding people or doing anything illegal, because I don't want that for the employees here. I think of it as, does that make for a great bumper sticker? No. Is it maybe more fun or satisfying to believe that these people are sort of shadowy supervillains, mustache twirling supervillains? Sure. Is it less satisfying to think of them as basically like people coding and creating technology products? Yes, but it's the truth.
Yeah. Well, before we got started today, we were talking about the series Halt and Catch Fire, which is about early coding in Silicon Valley. And those guys are very flawed characters, and nothing that they try to do is ever by some grand design. There is one character who has like greater ambitions, but he gets foiled at every step. But that's a very real kind of, I believe it's not entirely fictional, I think, but it's a very interesting character development of all the people that were interested in coding in the early days, and led to that environment that we're describing. Well,
Yeah, it's the other thing of it. So we can take it outside of let's for just to end on a different note, right? So end on maybe an analogous entrepreneur or somebody who had world historic impact, but probably never saw himself in those terms, or maybe saw himself, but in a different way. Steve Jobs is a quintessential example of an entrepreneur that many people around the world admire, that several people within this group that I studied admire. And you could sort of make this sort of dystopian case about like the effect of the iPhone around the world and what it did for distracted driving or something, right? But it's much more accurate to talk about his obsessive focus on product design and on intuitive products, and how that legacy has infected like everything, right? I have a Sonos speaker next to me. It has hallmarks of the same design, right? Like you have these products that are built that harken back to that tradition. And in that case, do I think that the conversation in the room was around, the iPhone takeover of the world or building the world's first $1 trillion company? Maybe. But it was much more likely that what they were thinking about is, hey, this button doesn't move super smoothly. We've got to like make the button better, right? And like that to me, like I actually find I find comfort in knowing that the conversation is far nerdier than we think it is. Yeah. And that's probably more likely that it's the nerdy version, not the grand design version.
We primarily write to and talk to through Zoom and on our podcast individual investors. They're people that have enough money to be worried about it, and they have opinions about the world, and they're very interested in things that come out of Silicon Valley. I think this book will give a very clear picture of the characters that are involved in the development of PayPal, which is a very important startup in that space. But what they're interested in now, what I'm interested in now as a publisher too, is what are the next generation of companies that are either inspired by things that had happened leading up to PayPal, or use the technology, as you point out, like Yelp or YouTube. What do you have any, just from the conversations you've had with all these people, do you have any idea of what new technologies are being developed that you would be interested in following just because you heard of it during the interviews?
Yeah, it's a great question. And the big sort of disclaimer that you have to attach is like, I'm the last person to turn to for investment advice. This is just sort of observational. If you look at there's a great deal of public reporting around what they invest in. And when they put their money in something, it's a safe bet to you should take a second look at it. Like, they have a good track record. They know what they're doing. They're in the business of evaluating entrepreneurs. One of the places that I've become interested in is kind of the reemergence of nuclear and the kind of changes around like some of the regulations in nuclear. It would seem to me that even if you were just looking at the surface level headlines, there would be an argument in favor of paying attention to the field. But then you look at some of the investments that people in this group have made in that technology. There's energy companies in the United States that are being funded by several of the individuals that I interviewed. It would seem to me that like they're kind of making the same bet, like thinking that maybe there's a renaissance happening in the world of nuclear that's different than what we've seen in the past. I do think of the intersection of sort of nanotechnology and biotechnology, things like artificial intelligence and its applications, and satellite technology is all places where they've either put time, money, or energy, or are talking about it. And they have disagreements, right? I think there's been some pretty famous disagreements, particularly around AI. But I think of these as places where they're investing time and ergo are worth kind of paying attention to. The one that speaks to me most, because I just think it has a branding problem, is nuclear, right? Because I think we tend to conflate like nuclear disaster with nuclear energy, or nuclear war with nuclear energy. And I'm not well versed on this. Like, this is not a place I've spent years of study, but it seems to me that very smart people are putting a good deal of time, money, and attention behind this technology. And in particular, Europe is reducing regulatory hurdles to make these things a reality. And so I would bet that it's a great place to pay attention. But again, I think the other piece that is important for people who are investors who are listening is, when these people are in the business of evaluating companies, they are shaped by the PayPal experience. And a lot of what it seems to me that comes out of the PayPal experience is just the value of hustle and the value of very smart, very hardworking teams. They are looking for people who don't just have the right ideas. They're actually looking for people who can get to the right idea when they start with a wrong one very, very fast. And that's a different skill than coming up with the exact right answer to the math problem, right? Because it's very rare. I mean, you experienced this, I'm sure, when you built your publishing company. Like, it's very rare that you've got it right from the bat. And there's a great quote in the book from Musk where he says that essentially he's like, a startup is a process of rapidly discard. Like, you kind of have an idea, it's wrong, and then you kind of iterate until you get to the right answer. That is not a formula. I think that's sort of characterological, but it's the character of a team. Like, how quickly and rapidly you can do that while still saying solvent is actually the big startup question.
Yeah, the phrase we use is fail quickly, and don't fail the same way twice, because you have to learn from what you did wrong. And we try to teach that to everybody that comes into the company at one time or another. Sometimes it takes, sometimes it doesn't, but
right.
But that is the value of the team. All right, Jimmy, thank you. I'm going to hold up Founders again. This is the latest one, and this is the story of PayPal and the interesting characters that come together to change the way we do commerce online. And also, I found this book really interesting. It's Claude Shannon. I actually I didn't even know his name until I quoted from George Gilder, who I believe had been doing some research, and you followed up by sending me a copy of this book. This is like a year ago or something.
Yeah.
And then gave me an extra copy to give to George. So I appreciate that. And this is an interesting read because it's really kind of theory and a dream that is now, as you point out, during the pandemic, is really taking hold for all of us. So I appreciate you taking the time to join the Wiggin sessions, and I'll keep in touch. We'll have to find out what your next book on nuclear energy is.
Well, I'm taking a breather from books for a bit, but I appreciate you taking the time, not just to do the interviews, but to read the books and to actually ask these kinds of questions. Like, it's important. I mean, these are big ideas that shape our society, right? And so I appreciate that you actually provide a forum for us to think and to talk about them and to read books that are about these people. And like, I am just grateful for that.
All right, great. Hopefully people will go out and buy the book and read it themselves. All right, thank you, Jimmy.
Thank you very much, Addison.